So today I wanted to share some information with you about what the S&P 500 is and how you can purchase uh, this in your 401k. So what is the S&P 500? So the S&P 500 itself is just a list of 500 stocks. And so which stocks are included? It's the 500 largest companies in the United States listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, and their size is determined by their market capitalization. And there are a few companies that might have two types of stocks issued, maybe A and B stocks. So there could be maybe 505 shares, 505 stocks included in there, but there will only be 500 companies. So one of the criteria is that a company has to be worth more than 500 or more than $5.3 billion to be included on the S&P 500. And then the question would be, do those 500 stocks change? Yes, they do. So there's a method for calculating how you put the companies on and off the list, basically just which companies are growing or shrinking. And there's an approximate turnover rate of 5% a year, or 25 stocks a year. So I mentioned market capitalization. So the market capitalization is just the outstanding shares times the share price. So you can see for 3M have 615 million shares at $1.50 share price, gives you a market capitalization of $92 billion. So can you purchase the S&P 500? Yes and no. So the S&P 500 itself is just a list of stocks. And so in order to purchase into the S&P 500, whatever company that you have your 401k or Roth IRA or whatever through, that company has to themselves go and build a fund by purchasing all the stocks in the correct quantities to represent the S&P 500. And so that company, and I'm sure that they have a computer program set up to do this, and that company will have to then buy and sell the stocks as they're added and removed for the S&P 500 for that fund to correctly reflect the S&P 500. So this is just a snapshot from my 401k of the information in the S&P 500 index that I have some of my 401k in. So you can see that total, the market capitalization of all the S&P 500 companies is anywhere between 16 and 19 trillion dollars. Obviously, that's changing daily. So this is a total, money-wise, of 80% of the stocks traded in the USA. And so obviously you can see that different companies weight more heavily in the S&P 500. So if Apple loses $100 billion for some reason, that will make a lot bigger dent than if another company loses a smaller amount of money. So you can here you can see that Apple is the biggest makeup of the S&P 500 with a little over 3% just by itself. And you can see just the top 10 companies make up over 17%. And so, that leaves another 490 companies to make up 80%. So, obviously they're not weighted individually. So this graph just shows you history of, where the S&P 500 is going, and shows you maybe why you'd want to put money in the S&P 500 or the stock market in general. So if you put money in here, around 1995, so you put, $10 in the S&P 500 here, by 2000, you would have had, would have tripled. So you'd have $30, and then obviously you would have shrunk back here, and, then you'd be back to, hey, I'm only down to $20, and then you're back up to the 30. And, the thing is, if you're still investing money here, you're any money you put in here, you've gained that money back by here. And then obviously, if it falls down again and, back up, and obviously the market's cyclical. So, if you take this kind of 15-year snapshot and kind of cut it off and you went back to 1995, it looked probably pretty similar right along here. Since the numbers are getting so much bigger, the swings look wider, but percentage-wise, it's probably pretty close. You see here, if you had 400 out, if the S&P was at 400 here, and it dropped down to 300, that's just as big of a drop from 1500 to 1000. You're pretty close. So that's kind of what I know about the S&P 500. I hope this was helpful.